flat aid was put in place for those, can you go back one, John? A flat aid was put in place so that everybody got some aid, even the wealthiest districts. The state must guarantee that a basic educational opportunity be available to each student, and the state should be obligated to contribute to the educational program only if the school district provides a program which meets those state standards. In 1973, much higher appropriation for equalization aid to relieve local property taxes, and that's what equalization aid does. It reduces the amount of the local property tax responsibility for the taxpayers based on wealth. They discontinue the flat aids, institutes a power equalizing program providing for negative aids, which means a district that is really wealthy may have to go pay a negative aid because of their ability to raise money without increasing the levy so much. Separates the shared cost into primary and secondary levels with a two-level system of state aid in which school costs, which exceed the statutory ceiling of aidable costs. Here's what that means. They used to figure out that about the state average in spending. So they look at the state average of spending. What they did at this point was say, we'll aid that in the primary level at 90% of what the per pupil average is in the state. But then we will aid it at less when you move into the secondary, which means you move into the secondary after you meet 90% of that initial state average per student. So what it did is reduce some of the general aid that you were getting to some of the districts. 1992, our organization was created. And our organization was created originally to get districts that were suffering from inequities together to create a legislative voice. And our goal at that time was to simply try to drive some legislation that would create equity throughout the state for all kids. And it's important to understand that our association really has two primary purposes. Equitable opportunity for students and equity for taxpayers. That's what we want the fairness to be. So it was originally started in 1992. In 1993, we found that those efforts didn't work. We couldn't get movement legislatively. So we took a look at the equalizing factors. In 93, the legislature substantially ignored what we proposed, and they expand special education, or special adjustment aid, broadens the eligibility requirements, and diverts funds from the equalization aid appropriation to pay for it, imposes pupil revenue caps. So we've been under revenue caps since 1993, right? And the reason they went to revenue caps is because if we can control your revenue, we can control your spending. And at that time, when Tommy Thompson was governor, a whole bunch of money got put into K-12 education. But the vast majority of that money went into general aid. They wanted to control property taxes, right? They wanted to get property taxes down. And they did it on the backs of staff, right? We went to the QEO law, which means that if a school board offered 3.8% of benefit and wage increase, then there was no opportunity to go up to arbitration anymore by staff. And you'll see that in a number of cases, legislation was passed to save money on the backs of staff members, of teaching. Per pupil revenue limits, aka spending caps, school districts have two main sources of revenue under the caps: state aid, which is our general aid, and the local tax levies. What that means is, in my district, if I had $10 million to spend and I got $6 million of general aid, I have to tax for $4 million. That's what I tax my people for. The important thing to remember, though, is that when money gets poured into general aid, it doesn't give me more money to spend. My $10 million revenue cap is $10 million, whether I get $6 million of aid or $7 million of aid. I'm still capped at that $10 million. And when people start talking about, well, look at all the funding that goes into schools, they've got to be very careful about what that funding really pays for or doesn't pay for. Targeted federal aid, typically about 3.6% is federal aid. It's not under the cap. It funds the title programs, Title I, II, III, IV, special education, and some English learners. The spending caps in 1993, the caps were set. And the caps were set based on what districts spent in 1992. So if you were a real fiscally conservative district in 1992, you've been punished by this current system. And if you were a high spender in 1992, you've reaped some benefits from that. So from the very get-go, there have been inequities in this whole system. In 1993, also, the state average was $58.17. 24 districts had revenue limits of over $7,500 per student. So when you think about, here's a district that every year since 1993 has been able to count for $2,000 more per student every year. Think about the compounding impact of what that does to the low revenue districts. No logic or rationale for the 90-92 limits, except that we wanted to control property tax, right? So we did that by then. Governor signs budget containing WASB agenda items. Go ahead, John.
So this is new. I don't.
Yep. Go ahead.
Should I jump in? Because
Go ahead and jump in anytime.
I worked with Sherry Krause from the School Boards Association. She sent me all these issues of the newsletters from that time period, and it was really interesting to look back. So you notice the date. This is August 1993. This was a new biennial budget, and here's Governor Thompson. This is Ken Cole writing. With the gains comes some pain in the form of revenue limits. School districts will be able to increase spending by the CPI. The limits are in place for 5 years, right? Legislators promised future modifications in the formula to ensure equity. And the governor says,
5 years isn't quite long enough.
yeah, that's coming up.
Right.
But I can assure you.
I can assure you we will continue to look at equity question this fall and come forward with a plan in the next biennial budget.
So, let's look ahead. February 1995. Thompson's budget calls for sweeping changes.
Thompson said revenue limits on school districts made the tax cut plan possible, cost controls work, and I want to see them made permanent. He said Thompson also proposed that the lowest spending school districts receive new flexibility under the revenue caps to bring their per pupil spending closer to the statewide average, calling education the key to Wisconsin's success.
So the camel got his nose under there, and now he's all the way in the tent.
You know, that's important to know. It's important to know that legislation gets passed at times with a sunset, and then that sunset is removed because it worked, right? Property taxes dropped. And if that was the only goal, we would say that worked. What didn't work? The funding for schools, right? The data dashboard, Mount Horeb. John, I'll let you talk about
so you
Mount
should
Horeb.
have copies of these. If you don't, you can pass them around. Does everybody have one of those? Okay, so we wanted to tell the story of state funding. So we put together, we worked with Andy Rashowski, who's an economist at UW-Madison, and R.W. Baird. It's the financial services company that provides support for school districts all over the state. And we worked with them to identify historical revenue limit changes and tell that story. So if you look at Mount Horeb, it happens to be where we live, you can see that their revenue limit was substantially below the state average. In this box here, it says it was set at $53.30 per student, almost $500 below the state average, and they've remained below every year since. What we did was we took then the average amount, or the difference between their revenue limit and the average, and we added that up for the 28 years. You can see in the box down here, that total amount was $46 million. And I'll tell you, as a taxpayer in Northport, Wisconsin, I see that number and I say, well, guess what? I had to pass a referendum to do the work on our school because we didn't get that $46 million from the state, right? And it was $2.9 million just last year alone. So if you're an AEF member, you'll get to read an interview that I did with Steve Salerno in the newsletter coming up in August.
So Neilsville. If you take a look at Neilsville in 93, 94, our per pupil amount was $5,100. We're $700 less per student than the state average. Not the high spending, the state average. So we've been penalized in this formula for a long, long time. And you can see the state average versus Neilsville's amounts. Now, important to know, you know how we made all these great gains? We had to pass revenue limit referendum. We've passed 5 since I've been there. 3 have been recurring, meaning they're ongoing. 2 have been non-recurring. But without, and that only got us to here, where we're talking about millions of dollars. So if you look at here, to provide an adequate education to all of its students, we have a spending gap of about 2.6 million. Think about what our district could do with just, I tell our people at our annual meeting all the time, I wish we were average. Man, if we were average, we'd have $1 million more to spend every year. But we're not even average at the school district of Neilsville, and we're not even average after going through what they tell us to go through and go to referendum, right? To get more. The question becomes then this. It's not, is it just a funding issue, or is it an opportunity issue, right? Do we have not just a financial responsibility, but a moral imperative to say, there are opportunity gaps depending on where kids live in this state. Where you live matters for what you can get or what you might not be able to get. And then you go back to the Constitution and say, is the legislature living up to the constitutional call that they're responsible for?
So
go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, I found this really interesting in the AEF history, that they were formed in '92 to provide legislative solutions. In '93, the legislature failed to act, and in '94,
Here we go.
Here we
retained
go.
some legal counsel, and we looked at suing the state. We looked at it under 2 causes. The uniformity clause, the legislature shall provide by law for the establishment of a school district which will be nearly as uniform as practicable. Equal protection clause, all people are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. Equal opportunity for education is a fundamental right. Isn't that what public education is all about? It's supposed to be the great equalizer, right? Doesn't matter. The beauty of public education is it doesn't matter where you come from. When you hit the front doors of that school, everybody has equal opportunity, right, to succeed. AEF unanimously prepares for litigation. 95-97 state budget increases state aids and levy credits to 2/3 of partial school costs. The budget, however, does not resolve several equity issues such as distribution of equalization aids, school levy credits, categorical aid, and the impact of revenue limits on the identification of student needs. On October 12th, 95, the class action lawsuit, Vincent Voigt was challenging the constitutionality of Wisconsin schools' finance system. Now, Voigt was actually the superintendent in Elk Mound. Bill Vincent was the superintendent in Elk Mound, and he was the plaintiff in this case. Also, I want you to take a look at this, levy credits. Levy credits are what you see on your property tax bill every year that says your property taxes have been reduced by that much, right? We're giving you that levy credit. You know what that's counted as? School aid. Now, I have worked as the district administrator in Neillsville for 25 years. And to this date, I have never had anybody come in with a check and say, hey, the school levy credit was $335. Here's your check. All that the levy credit is a property tax reduction act. However, you know what the levy credit amount is that's counted as K-12 school funding in this state? It's over $1 billion. Over $1 billion in this state is counted as K-12 funding, but it is simply property tax relief. And none of that money gets distributed to the schools. Vincent Boyd complaint, the state aid formula disequalizes, general aids are disequalized, categorical aids are disequalized, revenue limits are disequalizing, school levy tax credit disequalizes. You know, I talked about general aid. The general aid, remember what is paid for based on your poverty level, how poor you are? Guess how levy credits are distributed? How much property you own. So the more you have in property, you get more of a levy credit. So we call that the reverse Robin Hood effect, right? We're taking money from the poor instead of putting it into general aid and giving it to the wealthy. And with levy credits, guess where a high percentage of that money goes? Out of state. Think of all of the lake homes and all of the places that are owned by people that don't live in the state of Wisconsin. I think about 15% of the Lake Geneva people live in Lake Geneva year round, and the rest of that property is owned by others. So again, disequalizing.
Can I just ask a clarifying question about
Sure.
that? Because I'm a little slow today. So, okay, so I've also heard that, so I know like with our district, as property value increases, our aid gets reduced. So it disincentivizes or puts us kind of in competition with things that actually would be helpful to students, like lowering the number of rental homes, like working with the city to do like housing. It actually hurts our school district funding. So, and then are you saying like in addition to that, on the property tax end, there's property tax credits given to those higher, but then that's not translated though into school funding? That's what I
Correct.
just heard? Okay, so make sure I understood that.
Correct.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing that's happening, and it happens in Neillsville, is one of the things that never occurred to legislature in 1992 were declining enrollments. Right? We had lots of kids in those days. When I started as the superintendent, maybe it's a reflection on me, we had 1,300 kids in the district. Now we have 900. So we've lost 400 kids. So of that revenue limit amount, we're multiplying that number by a lot fewer kids. But the other thing that's impacting us is our property value is going up, but our number of students is going down. And remember, to figure out how wealthy a district is they divide that property value by the number of kids. So what's happening in Neillsville? We look richer, right? We look richer in the formula. So our general aid is going down. So where is the taxpayer fairness again, right? Because our wages aren't booming. And it's another inequitable system that needs to be looked at. So, what's the difference between equal and equitable? Here's a pretty good diagram, right? And a lot of what we're doing now with per pupil increases, not in revenue caps, but just everybody gets $745 for per pupil amount. Well, that's equalizing, or that's equal. But here's Neillsville again, right? We still can't see the ball game. However, if we got to some equity, maybe, I'm sorry, John. We'd maybe be able to see the ball game. So, pretty good diagram there. A decade of studies and committees. 96 legislative committee, council special committee on the school aid formula. The committee is directed to study the state aid formula and related aspects of school finance. No action by lawmakers. 2003, Governor Doyle creates a task force, looks at educational excellence, and gives a broad charge to review the K-12 funding. 2004, Governor's task force completes its work Again, no significant actions by lawmakers on the recommendations. 97, Dane County Circuit Judge Callaway rules in favor of the state in the Vincent Voigt case, finding the school system constitutional. In his comments, however, Judge Callaway says he recognizes that schools have grave pressures and notes the court does not doubt that these problems have a serious adverse impact on the education received by many of Wisconsin's children. 98, 99, the 4th District of the Court of Appeals hears our oral arguments on Vincent Voigt and upholds the trial court decision. AEF reorganizes as an unincorporated association and appoints an executive director. 99, the Wisconsin Supreme Court agrees to hear the case. AEF expands its membership to individuals in addition. In 2000, the Vincent decision, we lost. The Wisconsin Supreme Court finds our finance system to be constitutional. They do not agree that revenue limits adversely affect the constitutionality of the school finance system. If schools want to spend more, they can go to referendum. The rights at issue are not complete denial of educational opportunity. The legislature establishes expectations for a sound basic education, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the 20 standards. And poor performance on proficiency tests in low revenue districts is not equal to unconstitutionality in the state finance system. Now, let's talk though about going to referendum. When schools go to referendum, that can be tremendously disequalizing. Think about the money that Sun Prairie can raise in a referendum with their tax rate going up a little bit. Think about the school district of Neillsville trying to raise that same amount of money and what it does to their local taxpayers. But you know what the good news is about public schools in the state? People are passing referendums, right? And we passed them so well that guess what happened legislatively? They said, wait a minute, you guys are passing too many referendums. And when we went to 2/3 funding back in 1992, that guarantee, right, that we were gonna fund 2/3 of all school costs, including referenda, the state said, wait a minute. We used to have that used to be what's called a sum sufficient amount, meaning whatever the state spent, we gotta meet that 2/3. Well, a pretty simple change in legislature was make it sum certain. We're just gonna name a number now. And that's the number we're gonna use, and that's the number that goes into the general aids. So we're gonna limit it. I was actually on the Here and Now show, debating Dewey Strobel from down in the Cedarburg area, because he was claiming that we had voter fatigue, that voters were tired because schools were coming back with referenda too often. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we cherish the sacrifice of veterans, but voters are too tired to go vote. We've worn them out. Is that really the case? So we did get some limitations on when we can go to referendum now. So again, not the greatest option all of a sudden. So long as the legislature is providing sufficient resources that school districts offer students, the equal opportunity for a sound basic education is required by the Constitution, the state school finance system will pass constitutional muster. So that was the decision at that point. But what did we win in that lawsuit? An equal opportunity for a sound basic education. You remember that was way back in 1949, we talked about that. But what did that mean? That students in districts are not fungible and takes into account districts with disproportionate numbers of disabled students, economically disadvantaged students, and students with limited English language skills. Not fungible means not interchangeable. They are unique. Takes into account means funding is allocated specifically for those needs. So now we have at least some type of definition of what a sound basic education is, which means if you don't take into consideration economically disadvantaged kids, special needs kids, and EL kids, then your system is problematic. Then you have a problem, because we all know that all kids can learn, but some take more support. to learn, right? Justice William Babbage at the time said, however, if the inequitable funding conditions outlined above remain unattended, the system will inevitably get worse. If the legislature does nothing, the children will be back demanding their constitutional guarantee. For the first time, this court has articulated the standard behind the constitutional guarantee to our children of an equal opportunity for education. The guarantee of an equal opportunity for education finally has some teeth. Justice Diane Sykes said, the constitutional right to education announced by the court today guarantees not better schools, but biannual school finance litigation as dissatisfied combatants in the battle for state education dollars go to court with claims of educational inadequacy. Well, that hasn't happened. She anticipated, hey, schools are coming back every 2 years. We're gonna have a lawsuit sitting here every couple of years because we know we didn't solve it in this case. However, our case was decided in 2000. It's been 2 decades since that's happened. An equal opportunity for sound basic education as determined by meeting the 20 standards in PI 18. So the 20 standards that school districts have to sign off as meeting every year. Licensure for staff, staff development, remedial reading, kindergarten, guidance and counseling services, hours of instruction, emergency nursing services, library media services, safe and healthful facilities, health, physical education, art, music, curriculum, and all of those things. Well, take a look at the bold ones. In spirit, are we meeting those 20 standards? How many school districts do you know that don't have school nurses anymore? Right? How many have reduced guidance and counseling services, library services? So is one person to serve 1,000 students meeting the standard? Because that's what a lot of things are happening. Curriculum planning. How many districts used to have a C&I person, curriculum and instruction person, that don't anymore, right? Here's an interesting one. Gifted and talented. How many have a gifted and talented coordinator in their district? How many don't? Go ahead, John. So are we meeting those 20 standards? Let's summarize the history, state laws and budgets that disequalize, studies showing that problems and making recommendations, groups working for improvements, lawsuit with a new standard for constitutional school finance, students and districts not fungible. Funding must take into account the high needs kids. The Vincent decision, we lost and the revenue limits are okay so long as the districts can meet the 20 standards. Funding for high needs groups isn't bad enough to completely deny education. We won. Districts are not fungible. The system must take into account local needs, including the ability to raise funds. The system must provide adequate funding for 3 high needs groups, special ed, low income, and English learners. Since 2000, John, what's happened?
Well, not many good things have happened. So I'm gonna jump in here and do some next steps. Things have gotten worse, okay? Revenue limits have continued, and they have an ongoing negative effect on school operations. Spending is down, special education funding has dropped, and I'm gonna show you a very interesting chart about that. We're one of the few states that still doesn't provide specific funding for students who come from low-income homes. And as John suggests, it takes more to educate a child out of poverty to proficiency. And our English language funding is minuscule. I guess that's not gonna work. I wonder if this one will work. No? All right, I guess I gotta step on this side. So, this is 28 years of revenue limit history. Now, do you have this one as a separate sheet, John?
Yep. No, it's in the.
No, okay,
packet. I don't
all right.
have that.
So the numbers are small, I apologize for that. What you see here is the 5th percentile, the average, and the 95th percentile of revenue limit. So remember, it started out at about 5,800. Look at how this has changed, and look at how that gap has increased so substantially. So you can see that revenue limits have gone up, yeah, But if you started at the bottom in 92, and by the way, when they made that rule in 93, nobody knew that 92 was gonna be the banner year, right? I mean, it was all of a sudden, guess what? Whatever you spent last year, that's your number. Uh-oh. Here's the, what's called the standard deviation. This is kind of the spread, the average amount of difference between the low and the high. It starts out at about 800, and it's now at about 1900. So the difference has gotten so substantial, Julie.
Can you just repeat that?
Sorry?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. The standard
I mean,
deviation,
Just for emphasis, can you just repeat that?
the average amount of difference between all the districts, so what you do, well, I won't go into the statistics, has gone from about 900 to over 1900. So the spread has gotten much greater.
So Julie, I think what you're looking for is, it's gotten worse, right?
Yep.
I just wanted a no shift.
Yeah.
Can we use that language?
No, but I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the revenue limits, those districts who taxed to the max, even though they didn't need it, got to put all that extra money in their fund balance. So the rich got richer, but the schools like John's schools, who were just being very conservative and just spending what they needed, were punished.
Correct?
I'm super ignorant about finances, so I'm nervous about asking dumb questions.
You're
So,
fine.
I'm curious about, like, has anybody taken this data and this information and matched it with the test scores from these districts then over time? Have they matched it with vouchers? Like, I'm from Watertown. We were so low in 92 and have been stuck there. And now we're getting screwed over by the vouchers. Like, we're number 4 after like Milwaukee and like massive school districts.
Yeah.
Like, we're just stuck.
So
We need to have
that's,
you join the presentation.
yeah,
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
done.
no.
You're doing
Well,
just fine.
So we're gonna talk a little later about what I'm calling Vincent 2, or Gaier versus
Ha!
somebody.
That won't get much traction, I'm afraid.
So that's exactly what we're gonna do next.
Okay.
We have to start to do those analyses, but the problem is that there are a lot of factors that go into student achievement, right? And spending certainly will help you improve, but if you came to my reading presentation, if you spend money on junk, you're gonna have bad reading outcomes. And we have too much of that going on too. So what we plan to do is show a lot of different correlations and hope that there is enough weight in those correlations to sway a judge.
Well, and even policy, I mean, I shouldn't say policy, but like numbers of the fact that, like, I can say, and I'm so sorry, I don't wanna throw Watertown under the bus, but like, there's pressure in our districts that I work in the middle school and was at the high school, and there are kids that are exited out of ESL support programs in that transition year between 5th to 6th, because they're going to different buildings, and nobody follows up, and nobody, like, they're not ready, their scores are not legit to exit the program, but now suddenly we have less students who need those services. And,
The other
like,
thing,
they're
well,
lies.
it's really interesting, because where I was the superintendent, we had no EL services. We had like nothing for gifted and talented. I don't even know who the gifted and talented person was. I think there was a curriculum plan on a shelf somewhere, but all the things that go with it. So as John was saying, you know, the ability of districts to meet these standards has been whittled away and whittled away and whittled away. And at some point, we're having the conversation about the superintendents and boards getting together and saying, we're not gonna authorize that we're actually meeting the 20 standards. We can't do it. And does that help our case legally? We can also apply for waivers from these things. So maybe we should just start doing that, because we can't meet all these requirements without adequate funding.
Well,
Touch a little bit though on your question. We funded 3 different studies. One of the studies was the relationship to being able, what we can spend per student and report card data.
Yeah.
There is a correlation
Yeah.
between what you can spend and what that report card data shows. So it does matter. And again, to me, it's about an opportunity gap.
This is a little finer look at the revenue limit just in the last 10 years. What you can see is that the districts at the bottom are increasing 76 per year versus $262 a year at the top and 136 at the middle. It's amazing. It's just gotten worse and worse and worse. So this map, you have a color copy of this. These are all the districts that are
Everybody have
at
one?
$10,000 or less per student. And the ones in green are $12,000 or more. So I just took this little section of the map to say, how would you feel if you were in Waupun or Portage or Oshkosh, and you knew that the folks in Green Lake were getting a couple $1,000s more per kid. I think I mentioned we live in Mount Hora. Wisconsin Heights is just north of us. We're at 10,000. You had got the data dashboard there. Heights is at like 14,000 per kid. When I was superintendent in Thorpe, we were at 10,000. The neighbor to our south was over 12. They were like 12.5. And we were demographically almost exactly the same, very small communities. Property values were the same, the free and reduced, special ed, but they got $1.2 million every year for the same number of kids, more than we got. And it was just, you'd go in there and the quality of the materials were better. Everything was newer. The clubs that were advertised, that were, for the kids to participate in, the facilities, the sports facilities, everything was just fundamentally better.
I think the other thing, though, is important to understand is, we don't want to take their money.
Right.
Exactly.
We want to lift the other boats. And I think that's the important message that we want to get out there. Because we always talk about winners and losers, right?
Yep.
There's winners and losers, right? Here's a winner, there's a loser. We can't do anything if we're gonna cause the winners to become losers. Well, we got losers. When are we going to realize we already have created losers? We've got to create more winners.
So at the end of today's session, I've got the evaluation, and I'm gonna ask you for t-shirt mottos. We were kicking around, I'm an AEF member, my kids are losers. And have been for 28 years, because we're losers in the revenue limit discussion.
Just so you know, Green Lake has had to go to referendum over and over and over, just like many others. So,
Yeah.
the system doesn't work in Green Lake. They have lots of part-time staff, and they've tried all kinds of innovations to maintain their student numbers, and maybe some were successful and some not, but anyway, I don't think Green Lake is a winner in the system.
Yeah. Spending is down. When you look at spending per pupil, look at inflation adjusted 14,900 in 2009. 10 years later, it's actually down when you adjust for inflation. With no revenue limit overrides, that number's down substantially as well. So our revenues have been pinched and overall spending is down. This is a histogram of the number of districts spending at various levels. So most districts spent between 11.5 and 12,000. But you can see that distribution, and there are districts up here over $22,000 because they get more money, right? They can spend more because they get more. That's the unfair system. So that's revenue limits and spending. And
Can I say one thing though?
Yeah,
John?
sure.
This is from the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Most of us remember what happened in 2010, right, with Act 10, where what we were going to do is create savings for districts on the backs of teachers, right? From 2011 to 2018, Wisconsin is ranked 49th in the nation in per pupil education investment increases. 49th in what we've increased from 2011 to 2018. That's from Wisconsin Policy.
so, as Tressa said, school finance is complicated, but there ain't nothing complicated about this. This is as simple as hand in front. It's just a antiquated, unfair system that needs to change. So we're gonna talk next about special education funding. And it relates to that Vincent decision, right? Because they said, they're not fungible, and we have to take into account special ed, EL, and poverty. So this is the special ed piece of the puzzle. The way this works is that kids are identified. There's a lot of special ed law out there, and you have all kinds of people whose job it is to make sure that you're following that. Every child who qualifies gets an IEP, an annual plan. That plan is fulfilled by the district and paid for out of this special fund called Fund 27. That's a accounting rule, okay? At the end of every fiscal year, Fund 27 has to equal 0. So whatever amounts you got back from the state or from the federal government, the rest of it has to be covered by the district, okay? And that's a transfer from Fund 10, which is your general fund. And I bring that up because those numbers are very discrete and easily identified, and those folks at Baird helped us get those numbers. The special ed funding from the state has gone down steadily, and you can see the numbers. And I put the arrows on here because this is when the Vincent case was filed, and this is when the Vincent case was decided. And look at what's happened even since then. So as you start to think about being strategic about another lawsuit, you start to say, has it gotten so low that we've got an argument that it's fundamentally inconsistent with the Vincent decision? We took those transfer amounts and recognized that districts want to do the right thing. But without more funding from the state, it's very difficult. And we have to take money from regular education to fund special education. So we took those dollar amounts and we divided them by the number of non-disabled kids in those districts. Not to say that it's their fault, but the reality is we're taking money from regular education to fund special education. And those dollar amounts are the transfers per non-disabled kid. In other words, every non-disabled kid in the state is funding special education because the state is not doing their job. They're not providing adequate funding. And you can see the dollar amounts. If the districts that are in red are spending more than $2,000 per non-disabled kid to cover the costs of special education. Look, it's right here. We're here in Sun Prairie. They're between $1,500 and $2,000, I think was the number, or $1,750 maybe. Edgerton, Fort, where were you, Watertown? Watertown, are you on here?
Yep.
Yep, there you are. Every kid in your district who doesn't have a disability is funding all of those IEPs. I know it's not a nice thing to say, but you've got to realize the implications, right? And we want to do the right thing. We want to educate kids with disabilities. That's our moral responsibility. Wisconsin's special education law predated federal special education law because we get that. We want to do the right thing. But without adequate funding, it becomes very difficult. So this is a way to tell that story.
Arguably, special education may have been the greatest thing we've ever done because we started to look at students as individuals instead of groups, and finding a system that worked for individuals. However, we're not funding it as an important part of what we do, right? That's my view of special education. And again, who's to blame? It's not the kids that are special needs. We can't blame them for those large transfers. It's the lack of legislative passion to fund it, right?
There's a guy named Bob Pasternak who was an assistant secretary of education in 1976 when President Ford had this bill in front of him. He was in the room when President Ford signed the bill. He said his greatest hesitation was that it would not be adequately funded. Wisconsin, again, one of only a few states that doesn't provide any additional funding directly to address students from low-income homes. We've got SAGE and AGR, pretty small dollar amount. High poverty aid, even smaller dollar amount, but it's not spendable money. It reduces their levy, right? It doesn't increase their per pupil amount. It takes down the local levy. Federal Title I. But you gotta ask, does this take into account, is this adequate effort by the state to recognize the additional burden, the requirement under the Vincent standard? Wisconsin's got about 50,000 English learners, some concentrations, but a lot of kids just kind of spread out in small numbers.
if you remember, I said we have more cows than people in Clark County. Guess who's milking the cows and coming to our schools? Hispanic families. And the way EL works for us is we get about $1,300 appropriation for EL. However, you have to have at least 10,000 to be able to spend it. So we have to join a consortium of other schools to get to $10,000 before we can even claim the money.
You can see the numbers, there's really very little amount there. And again, does this qualify? And then you might remember this event, right? This commission, 2 years, co-chair was Republicans. They recommended, number one, future increases in resources through increases in per pupil adjustment under revenue limits. And we got that in the last biennial budget. Went from 9,400 to 9,700 to 10,000 per kid. Interestingly, the per pupil aid, that $750, outweighed it. So remember, we talked about the standard deviation, that got worse. Remember that? So they did more in the per pupil versus the revenue limits. They said additional funding should be provided for special education, and they gave a whole range of possibilities. Remember that? It was all the way up to like 60% or something. We got 28% and then 30% and no change in this current budget. They said EL students should be weighted as 1.2 FTEs. In other words, a little bit more funding, no change. Same with low-income kids, no change. So what we have is these revenue limits that are really impeding our ability to meet the standards. The system doesn't take into account EL and low income almost at all. It doesn't recognize the burden of educating students with disabilities more than about 28 to 30%. It's what the Vincent decision addressed. So now, you heard the governor this morning talk about signing the budget. He emphasized the 2/3 funding, I get that. They had a $4 billion surplus. There were all kinds of proposals for equity, right? I mean, we gave them a bunch. And a lot of school districts testified there was an allocation of $128 million total in new funds. All the rest of that funding went to reduce the property tax burden. So John's district isn't gonna get any more than $10,100. But the proportion that's coming from the state is going up. His local taxpayers are gonna pay less. That's how we got to 2/3 funding. But everybody's gonna have the same dollar amounts to spend. No revenue limit changes, nothing for EL or poverty, a little bit of an increase for special education. So, working with Dr. Rashofsky from UW, we charted all the revenue limits for districts across the state. So this is North Lakeland School in Boulder Junction, Wisconsin. Here's Milwaukee. So these are their revenue limits across this axis. And then Dr. Rashofsky analyzed the data on students with disabilities, students from low-income homes, free or reduced, and English learners. And we gave each one of those kids that 40% FTE increase, 1.4. And he created an index of severity of need. And what we have here is kind of a line of about 25 districts that are significant outliers. And we're just wondering, would they make good plaintiffs in another lawsuit? Right? Have we gotten to the point where Vincent versus Voigt is actionable again? Right? We've got about 80 members. We've been growing. The data dashboards, they're pretty well received. You should have a membership application in your materials.
Right here.
And so what we're trying to do at this point is raise awareness, right? We want folks to know about this. Joining AEF is not expensive. But you can have a real impact on the inequities. And as John mentioned, even for districts that are not low revenue districts, you still have those burdens of those three groups, right? And B, what we've been asking for is not to gore your ox. We don't want to push all these folks down. We wanna rise the tide and float all boats. So everybody should get a CPI increase, because costs go up. But all those additional dollars should lift the districts from the bottom. That's been our approach all along. We've engaged council. We've got a leadership team focused on determining whether or not to file again. We've got actually a draft complaint at this point. And we're getting very serious. After the Blue Ribbon Task Force and decades of other studies and very little action on revenue limits, that standard deviation of revenue limits doubling in 20 years. And then you get the Blue Ribbon Task Force that says we should address these things, number one. Then they get $4 billion to work with, and they do goose egg. And you say, I think it's time. So we would invite you to join us. In fact, we're talking with the WEAC folks tomorrow or the next day.
Wednesday morning.
Yep. We've got.
Apply for this for them, you talked about it.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a very receptive audience with the WASDA, the School District Administrators. We've reached out to the School Boards Association.
Working with the Rural Schools Alliance to do presentations for them.
Yep, we're gonna be presenting at the rural schools, so there's an evaluation. We'd love to get your feedback on this presentation. I wanna get, if you could include on there teacher suggestions, like, we're a revenue loser or whatever, I don't know, something funny and fun. We're gonna be at the rural schools October 25th, and you've got the membership applications. So that's all the stuff that I wanted to make sure that you had. Now let's take questions.
Sorry, wanna jump the gun on this question, but is everybody in this room aware that in addition to all of this stuff that we just heard, that in 11840, the state allows the Office of Educational Opportunities to authorize a charter school that is a privately run but publicly funded school, which means that one person in an office in Dane County can take school funding from your district and reallocate it even though they're outside of your county. And the only person who's elected who has any say over that is the governor. Because the governor appoints the Board of Regents, who appoints the chancellor, who appoints the OEO director. So I'm curious about how that works actually. I don't know if you guys are, now I'm put you on the spot, but if you read the state statutes on local property taxes, it says in there that it's the county that administers the property tax dollars. So how is it possible that Dane County can reach into other counties and move their tax dollars around? Because I don't think that's legal. But it's been in the budget since 2015 to 2017. And I would love to see a lawsuit. Just gonna throw that out there. That's my t-shirt suggestion.
The other thing when we talk about taxpayer fairness, I don't know, I'll touch on vouchers just a little bit from a financial standpoint and how that works. So the funding for voucher schools actually comes from general aid. The money in the general aid is what pays for those kids to go to